Before anyone takes the plunge into home recording, it's important to get an understanding of some of the terms that initially come up. In this video, we'll cover just a few so that you can get a better understanding of the words that are important and can sometimes be confusing. We'll go over some also as they come up when we actually start recording, but this list would be a good start. Okay, so first up is the term DAW, and this stands for Digital Audio Workstation. And it's basically any computer software used to record, edit, produce any audio source. This not only includes music, but speeches, radio broadcasts, television, soundtracks, podcasts, any situation where audio is recorded. Now, there's a lot out there and there's always going to be a debate as to which one is best. We're going to take a look at just a couple in this video, but it's important to always remember it's really whichever one makes sense for you, whichever one you can dabble in a few or pick kind of a more beginner one, which is a couple that we'll look at. But there is no right answer here. It might be who you're wanting to work with. Maybe some other people in your band or people you're collaborating with use a particular DAW. Maybe you found something that just led you to believe that other people in your circle or one that you gravitate towards. There's really no right answer for which DAW to use. Next up is the audio interface. We're actually going to talk about two interfaces. The first one is the audio interface. This is the centerpiece of a modern recording system and handles the process of getting all the audio signals from the outside world into your computer by converting them from an analog signal into a digital format. It also plays back the digital signals to analog. And just easy to remember, even though you're recording digitally, if you're hearing it through speakers or headphones or anything, if our ears are hearing it, it's in the analog domain. Okay, so the conversion process, we'll talk a little bit more when we get more in-depth on interfaces. That's a critical part of any audio interface. Next up is the MIDI interface. So this device provides the MIDI in and out from a computer or any MIDI-equipped instrument. This can be transmitted either via the standard 5-pin MIDI jack or other connectors such as USB. And MIDI's been around for a while now. And it's an agreed upon schematic. So many different manufacturers and pieces of equipment and technology subscribe to the MIDI protocol. So what is the MIDI protocol? MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface, and it's an industry standard music technology protocol that connects digital music instruments, computers, tablets, smartphones, and it's supported by tons of different companies. Okay? Now, basically, one of the most important things you can understand about MIDI, in today's world of recording, it's very easy to record and edit MIDI. But sometimes people get confused about what's happening with the sound. And think of MIDI as kind of digitized sheet music. It's really just a language of music. There's no audio and no sound transmitted through MIDI cables and through MIDI devices. It's specifically a language, a digital protocol that goes between devices and triggers sound. So for example, a key piece of equipment is a MIDI controller. And this is just a keyboard like the one I have in front of me and the one I have behind me. And all that does, there's actually no sound in these keyboards. All it does is transmit MIDI to my DAW, and then inside my DAW I have what are called virtual instruments. And those are triggered by the MIDI information. And those virtual instruments, which are just software, they trigger the sound. So it's just important to keep that in mind, that there's actually no audio that gets transmitted through the MIDI cables. Latency. Latency Latency is the time it takes for an audio signal to travel through the entire recording system. Okay, so we've got cables, we've got analog signals getting converted to a digital stream. We have those digital streams coming from the hard drive and getting converted back out so that we can hear them. And latency is the total time it takes to travel through the entire system. Buffer size is kind of closely related to latency, and this is the amount of time allowed for a computer to process all the audio that's going on. So for example, if you have your software, if you have your DAW or whatever you're recording to, and there's 15 tracks, there's drums, bass, keys, vocals, guitars, synthesizers, all of that audio, once it's recorded through your audio interface into the system, then all of that audio is stored on the hard drive and it gets played back. So the bigger your session gets, okay, sometimes you need to increase the buffer size and allow for more time for the computer to process all of those tracks that are in there. And this is something that you may change throughout your project. A lower buffer size is going to do this much faster and allow the latency to be shorter and allow there to be not a noticeable difference from when you, for example, press play or record. This comes up quite often when you're recording live instruments. So say you're recording a vocal or a guitar and you have too big of a buffer size, you'll actually hear a delay because it's too much time for the computer to process all the audio and the latency gets too long, and so you actually hear a delay. And it's really hard to play because there's a delay. It's super hard. And so sometimes you need to go in and choose a smaller buffer size so that it's more real time. But if your project is very big, that might, start to introduce issues. The bottom line is just know that it's something that you can select, and when you're recording you want a small buffer size, and when you're mixing or dealing with a lot of tracks after the recording, you can increase the buffer size to give the computer more time to process all the audio. Channel versus track. This is the part of a recording console or a mixer that can process audio signals. Sometimes it's interchanged with track, which more refers to the recording audio stream. So for example, a mixer or a console or inside our DAW, we have so many channels, say 8 channels, 16 channels, 24 channel mixer. That means we can plug whatever the number is and control those independently. A track, when we get into a DAW, a track more refers to the recording part, back to analog tape machines or the 8-track recorder. Well, now inside a DAW, we can record hundreds of tracks. Okay, so we can have tracks, channels, sometimes they're interchanged, but there is a slight difference in the meaning of each. Clipping or peaking. This is a form of audio distortion that happens when a signal exceeds the maximum limit of the digital recording system. Now, this is important when we get into the process of recording, because as a guitar player, you might think, well, distortion, like a distortion on an amp, getting that crunchy guitar tone, that can be a very good thing. We obviously want that kind of distortion in that scenario with a guitar amp doing rock guitar or something. But when it comes to recording, clipping and the distortion that comes with clipping is very bad. We need to avoid it at all costs, and we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. Basically, no matter what signal's coming in, let's take the example of a distorted guitar. We have some pedals, we have plugins, we have an amp, whatever's giving us that distorted, crunchy tone that we want to record that in a way that records it very cleanly, and in the terms of the recording into the computer, we don't want any clipping or peaking. If that happens, there's no way to take it out after the recording. So we have to make sure that the level is exactly the way we want, and we're going to avoid clipping and that unwanted distortion. We'll talk a little bit more about that here when we get to some other terms. Headroom. This is the amount of signal level measured in dB that's available in a system before that unwanted distortion or clipping starts to get introduced and is added. So for example, 0 dB full scale is the maximum loudness level of most recording systems. And if you have a signal coming in, your guitar, your vocal, whatever, at -18, you've got 18 dB of headroom before you start to introduce that clipping. So we always want to be aware of headroom. We always want to make sure we have headroom, especially when we're recording signals and we're just starting to build up our track through the recordings, the initial tracks that we're recording. We always want to make sure we have headroom, and we always want to be aware of what that might be. And decibel, probably heard it before, it's simply the unit of measure relating to volume and loudness. All right. Some points of reference for us to keep in mind is that a quiet room is 20 dB. A busy street in a city might be somewhere around 60 dB, and an airplane taking off is around 120 dB. So if you're standing next to an airplane taking off, super loud, it's around 120 dB. That's also the level where we start to introduce damage and the threshold of pain for our ears. So 120 dB, you gotta be real careful with. And that's important when we talk later on about mixing headphones. We want to make sure that it's at a level that's not going to, affect our hearing. But that's for another topic at another time. For our purposes here, decibel relates to just volume and loudness. Dynamics or dynamic range. This is the loud and soft points of a sound recording over time. The higher the dynamic range, the more difference there is between the loudest point and the softest point. Best examples to talk about this are like, think of an orchestra where you have a very delicate solo violin, for example. It's playing by itself, it's very quiet, and then all of a sudden the whole orchestra comes in, the drums come in, everybody comes in, and it's super loud. That difference between that quiet solo piece and the whole orchestra is a large, wide dynamic range. There'd be a lot of dynamic range there. Okay, now let's think of like heavy metal or rock or a lot of electronic music. Those songs are usually loud from start to finish. There's not a lot of dynamic range. It's loud all the time. And this is actually a hotly debated topic when it comes to mastering or finishing records, the ones that you hear on Spotify or Apple Music or wherever you listen to music. A lot of modern music in certain genres has less dynamic range because it's just loud all the time. Okay, so dynamic range or dynamics is the loudness, how much difference there is between the loudest and softest points of your recording. Gain is synonymous with volume. Now, this is not to be confused with distortion, and I thought it was important to bring that up here because you might be used to the gain knob on your amplifier as a guitar player or something where you add gain, you get that crunchiness, you get that wanted distortion. When we're talking about recording inside a DAW and more of the engineering and recording part, gain is simply volume. So if you have a microphone or a guitar that's coming into your DAW through your interface, if it's too low in level or volume, you simply take the gain, turn it up, increase more volume, okay? And as we learned already, we definitely want to stay away from distortion as it relates to recording a signal. Gain staging is the process of making sure the level of the signal being recorded is at an appropriate level. It's not too quiet, it can still be heard, but it's not too loud to introduce clipping. All right, so gain staging is done as you're setting up to record a part, and you'll look at the levels coming into your DAW, you'll play, and then you'll set the gain level of volume somewhere where it's not too quiet, it's not too loud. Best thing to do here is to just play like you normally would, look at the levels, set the gain, and then play really loud and try to exaggerate what might be the loudest possible way you could play. If it's a vocalist, sometimes when it comes to recording, you set the levels, you think it's good, and then they might get too close to the microphone, and then it throws it all out. So you just want to play around with what the maximum and minimum might be, and set it at a conservative level so that you don't clip. That's gain staging. A preamp is an electronic device that amplifies any weak signal. For example, a microphone or an instrument pickup, and it transmits that for further recording or processing. You guys are familiar with preamp. It basically takes that signal and amplifies it. In the recording world, a microphone preamp is the best example of this, where it just boosts those microphone signals and get them up to a more healthy level that we can record. A plugin is a piece of software inside a DAW that processes the sound of a recording. And this is a super fun part of recording because there are so many plugins in today's world offered by so many companies. There's so many choices and exciting things that you can do to manipulate your sound and get that true tone and that signature sound that you want. And they're all little tiny bits of software that you can bring up inside the DAW to process your audio. And we're going to talk about this when we get into the recording, and I'm going to show you some really cool plugins that you can use. Things like EQ, compression, reverb, delay, flanger, all this stuff. There's a huge landscape of options available to you today, all through plugins. Signal processing is modifying a sound in a variety of ways. DSP means digital signal processing, and specifically refers to modifying a sound using a computer that runs mathematical calculations in order to make changes to the audio signal. Now, what does that actually mean? That simply means that those plugins that we just talked about that are going to be manipulating the sound, whether it's an EQ or reverb, the computer and those plugins use DSP, and they run mathematical calculations to make those changes. The good news is it's all happening behind the scenes. You never have to worry about math. You never have to worry about the algorithm. You never have to worry about any of that digital signal processing. For us, we just pull up the plugin we want and we make those changes, all right? Before plugins and computers, signal processors were those analog pieces of equipment like I have over here in my rack. Various compressors and EQs and things like that. Those are also signal processors. But since now we're dealing with modern recording using a DAW, we're mainly going to focus on the DSP of plugins. The dry signal is the amount of any signal that is not processed. So now that we're starting to get into talking about processing and plugins, the dry signal is the unprocessed signal. So take a clean guitar tone or a vocal, as you recorded it, that's dry. The wet signal is the amount of signal that has been processed. Okay, so how much reverb are you adding? How wet is that signal? Most plugins and most controls have 100% wet, or a dial, a knob that you can turn and make it 0 wet, which is dry, or 100% wet, which is hearing 100% of the signal. So that's kind of the difference between dry signal and wet signal. The fader is the part of the channel that is used to control volume of that channel, and usually faders are sliders in a straight line from 0 to max. Surely you're familiar with a fader. It's on that mixing desk. It's those sliders, and each one is controlling the volume of whatever is playing on that channel or has been recorded on that track. Okay, so this is where we start to get our blends using faders between where you want the drums and the bass and the vocals and the guitars to all sit. So it's basically a volume control. The pan pot is that control that places the sound either in the left speaker or the right speaker or somewhere in between. It's that little round thing, left, right. Sure, you're familiar with it if you deal with live mixers or anything like that. But basically we can, with this control, choose whether we want the sound in the left or the right or in the middle. So the guitar part, we just recorded it. We want to create the sonic illusion that the guitarist is off to the left side of that performance. This pan pot gives us that control to place it exactly where we want in the stereo sound field. A send, or an aux send, or just aux, is a way to route a signal that duplicates that signal that you then can process without affecting the original channel signal. So basically, take this guitar that we just recorded, a clean guitar tone or a vocal. We can use a send to send that signal to another channel, and then on that channel put a signal processor or a plug-in, and then that can be the processed channel, and then we can blend exactly what we want. We have the dry signal on one channel, the wet signal on the other one, and we use a send to send that signal and duplicate it so that we can process it. The timeline is a linear display of a song arrangement in a DAW. And this is really cool because with the advent of computers, we can now see our arrangement. We can see the intro, the bridge, the verse, the chorus, the solo, all in this timeline. And so we can now basically jump through any part of the song, and it's displayed right in front of us. And the timeline at the top shows us, for example, in a 3-minute song or a 4-minute song, we'll have that timeline and we'll know, okay, chorus 2 comes in at whatever it is, 2.5 minutes. So that's the timeline in a DAW. Transport is something that's been around for a long time, even before digital computers, back in analog recorders and tape machines. And these are the main control functions required for recording into a DAW or any recorder, such as record, play, stop, rewind, go to start, etc. So in a DAW, the transport is usually at the top or sometimes in a floating window where you'll have those controls for stop, start, play, rewind, record, stuff like that. BPM stands for beats per minute, and it also defines the tempo of your song. Mute, super common, no different than the mute on your remote control for your TV. That prevents all the sound in that channel from playing. Okay, so got 10 tracks, you want to mute the bass, you hit the mute button on that bass track. And so we can do that. Mutes are available on all of our channels, and it basically just prevents that sound from playing. I'm sure you're probably familiar with that term. Solo is a button that temporarily mutes all the other sounds so that only that one sound can be heard. So again, we have our song, we got a bunch of tracks, we got all the drums, bass, guitars, keys. Let's say you just want to focus in on that guitar part, hit solo, everything else mutes, you only hear that so that you can dial in the processing, make sure it's all correct, and just focus on that one sound using the solo button. Cycle or loop is the selected section of a recording that repeats continuously. So this is great because take, for example, a solo section, it might be 8 or 16 bars long. We can set up a cycle region or a loop region, and it's just going to repeat. So before we go to record it, we can practice that. We can make sure it's perfect. We can get really good at that particular section. And then when we're ready, take it out of cycle, record that part, and have it after we've practiced it a little bit. Signal flow is the path any signal travels from the input of a system to the output of a system. And it's important to keep in mind because signal flow can get pretty complex as we deal with going in through our interface, running through the DAW signal flow, sends, getting to the output. And so signal flow is often referred to as just that entire process that the signal travels to get in and out of our system. A take is a single recorded performance, and takes are multiple recordings of the same part. As we're recording, we're going to go record a take. We'll record multiple takes of that guitar lead we did. We might do it 5 or 6 times, and then we'll pick the best take that we like of the best performance. Comping, or a comp track, is an edited series of takes that makes up the best performance taken from multiple recordings or takes. And this is really cool with the advent of computers and modern recording using a DAW. This has become so easy now where you can record 5 or 6 takes of the same part, and you can literally go through and take pieces, different pieces of each one of those takes and comp them together to create a composite or a comp track that is the perfect best performance from those multiple takes. So in the case of that guitar lead, let's say you have an 8-bar section, you record it 5 or 6 times. Bars 1 and 2, take 1 you like the best, and then you kind of flubbed a note in bar 3. Sure, you could go back and record it, but you can also do multiple takes and then comp that together and take the first 2 bars from take 1, the next 2 bars from take 2, maybe bar 7 and 8 from take 6, and then edit those all together to be one continuous, really great performance. And that just saves time rather than sitting around for an hour to get the part right. The mix bus, or also referred to as the stereo output, master output, or mix out, is simply the main channel that all the other channels flow to in a multi-track recording. So if we have 24 tracks, some drums, bass, guitar, keys, vocals, all those things, they all get what's called summed down, and they all flow into the main mix bus or stereo output that is the left and right channels of the entire mix. This is ultimately what will come down and constitute our recording, which is what we listen to on a daily basis, and all the recorded music that we hear from all our favorite artists is just the sum of the mix bus of those multi-track projects. Now, a project or session is simply the digital file that saves all the information of the DAW that's associated with a multi-track recording. So no matter what DAW you're using or no matter what recording system you're using, each one has a little digital file that saves all the information associated with your track. How the arrangement is, what the tracks are named, track colors, any of the preferences that you can set, all the audio, how it's edited will all be in a big folder, and then inside that folder is a project or a session. Okay, now we're going to get simple for a second, but there's a reason. We're going to start with mono. Mono is a sound that has one source. And of course, stereo is one that has 2 sources rather than just one. And this creates the illusion of that horizontal space in the recording, the left and right, and that phantom image, which is in the middle, okay, because we only have 2 speakers, but we sometimes can get that image of that horizontal space in the middle. And it's important, as simple and silly as it might be to need to talk about mono and stereo, it is important because as we get into interfaces and as we get into channels and tracks, we do need to be aware of whether it's mono or stereo and what the difference might be. For example, a microphone is a mono instrument, of course. And a lot of times, whether you want to record a track either stereo or mono, the best rule of thumb is whatever you're recording dictates whether it's stereo or mono. So a guitar, mono. Vocal, mono. All right? A keyboard synthesizer that has a left and right output outside the back of that instrument, that would be a stereo recording. It has 2 sources, the left channel and the right channel coming out of that keyboard or synth, and then we go into our interface with 2 cables, and that's a stereo recording because some of those sounds will have like a stereo image. So it's quite simple, but it is important when we talk about recording to know whether you need a stereo or a mono track, and then with your interface, how many channels you would need depending on what you're going to record. And we'll talk about more about that later. A bounce is the process by which your DAW converts your project into a file on your hard drive. And this represents the final stereo mix of your song. So this is the version that you can upload to SoundCloud or post up or send it to your friends to listen to. This is the audio file that you would actually listen. So inside the DAW, when we get everything set the way we want, we get it sounding the way we want, we bounce that project into a stereo file. Now those bounces that we create come in different forms, in different formats. Again, probably have heard these before, but let's talk a little bit as it relates to recording. A wave is an uncompressed, lossless computer file format that is used for the storage of digital audio. It's a nice fancy definition. The important part here is lossless. All right, so when you talk about a wave and you're doing a bounce, you'll have a choice. Do you want to bounce it as a wave? That's the full, high definition, highest resolution, lossless quality of that recording that you made. Another one, MP3. Everybody's familiar with an MP3 in today's day and age, and that's basically a compressed, lossy file format for the storage of digital audio. And what that means, and the important part here again, is lossy. So what happens with an MP3 is you take that high resolution quality recording and you compress it down, throwing out some of the bits of information and create a smaller file. And that's of course the most popular today is MP3 and some other formats similar to MP3. The important part here between WAV and MP3 is lossless versus lossy. So it depends on what you're going to do with the song. If you're going to share it with family and friends, or you want to send it in an email or something small, or just as a reference of the song, you can use these MP3s. If you want a higher resolution one that you're going to send a recorded part to a bandmate so that they can put it into their DAW and then play their parts over top, we definitely want a wave bounce of that lossless version of that audio file. Okay, so these are common terms, but when we get into recording, we need to definitely know when to use lossless and when it's okay to use lossy.